The satellite imagery glowed against the dimly lit walls, mountains and etched in stark white shadows. Commander's voice was steady, almost too steady, as though he wanted no room for questions. The compound is fortified, surrounded by anti-aircraft systems. Any helicopter entering that valley won't come back out. No Apache can hit that target and survive. The words landed like final judgment. No Apache. Not hers, not anyone's. The dismissal wasn't personal, yet it felt personal all the same. From the back corner, Phoenix sat still, her regulation bun pulled tight, posture straight, hands resting in silence on the folder in front of her. She had learned long ago how to be invisible in rooms like this. To wait, to measure, to let others speak until the silence pressed too hard against her ribs. But tonight, the silence was suffocating. She glanced across the table. Men leaned forward, arms folded, nodding at each other, already pivoting toward ground assault options, already discarding the very thought of rotary air support. They didn't know, couldn't know. For 3 weeks she had studied this valley, this fortress, these shifting wind patterns that would tear lesser pilots from the sky. She mapped each canyon bend in her mind until she could fly it with her eyes closed. And yet here, in this room of commanders, she was nothing but background noise. Her throat tightened. She remembered Afghanistan, the first time she was told to sit this one out because conditions were too harsh for helicopters. That night she watched soldiers she knew return broken and bleeding, a mission half finished, because the air had not been there when they needed it. She swore then that she would never let someone else dictate the limits of what she knew she could do. And now history was repeating. The screen shifted again, pointed with his laser. 40 armed fighters, Russian and Chinese systems buried into the rock, narrow corridors. The terrain gives them every advantage. We estimate 60% casualties if we attempt a direct assault. The words rang with certainty, calculated doom, and still Phoenix's pulse didn't race. It steadied. Her mind whispered the thing no one else was saying: they're all looking at the wrong door. Because she had seen another one. She closed her eyes for a breath. She could almost feel the weight of the Apache's cyclic in her palm, the vibration of the rotor blades through the cockpit, the way the air pressed differently when you threaded between canyon walls. The risks were real, every one of them, but the path was real too, and she was the only one in this room who believed it. Her hand clenched. She'd been quiet long enough. "Sorry." The single word cut the air. Every head turned. Every eye landed on her, the pilot in the back who had dared interrupt final judgment. She rose slowly, voice even, steady with a conviction she hadn't yet revealed. "I'd like to volunteer for the air support mission." Why did the room go so quiet when she spoke? Phoenix felt every eye fixed on her, the air suddenly heavier than the mountains that had haunted the maps all night. She could hear the faint hum of the projector, the shuffle of papers stilled mid-motion, the breath held by men who were certain they'd heard wrong. Commander's jaw flexed. "Chief Anderson," he said carefully, like a man stepping across thin ice, "we just spent half an hour explaining why this operation is not feasible for helicopters. Did you not hear that?" Phoenix stood, her boots anchoring her to the floor. She had rehearsed this moment in her head but never believed it would feel this raw. "Yes, sir," she replied, voice firm. "I heard every word, and I believe you're all correct about the 2 approach routes you've studied. They are impossible." Her words echoed, and for a moment she thought she had lost them. Some commanders exchanged glances. One even gave a small, mocking smile, but she continued before doubt could crawl in. "There's a third way," she said. The silence cracked. A murmur rose across the table, frowned. "What third way?" Phoenix walked forward, her boots sounding louder than they should against the concrete floor. She stopped by the projection screen, eyes on the satellite imagery she had memorized long ago. With a small motion of her hand, she traced a narrow cut in the mountains. "Here, the Northwest Canyon system. It hasn't been considered in the mission plans." Major Sarah Cole, the air support coordinator, crossed her arms. That canyon is suicide. Too narrow. No maneuvering room. It was dismissed immediately. Phoenix met her eyes. With respect, ma'am, it wasn't studied long enough. It's navigable. Tight, yes. Dangerous, absolutely. But possible. Leaned forward, his voice sharper now. And what's your margin for error? About 12 feet on each side. Someone cursed under their breath. The room bristled. 12 feet in a helicopter's world was nothing. One gust of wind, one twitch of the wrist, and it was over. Pressed, and if you hit wind shear. Phoenix didn't blink. Then I crash. But if I make it through, I'll emerge with a clear shot at the compound before their systems even realize I'm there. Colonel Williams, the overall mission commander, shifted in his chair, studying her like a puzzle piece that didn't fit. Chief, do you understand what you're suggesting? If something happens to you in there, we can't get another bird in. We can't pull you out. Yes, sir, I understand. Her calmness seemed to unsettle them more than any protest would have. She could feel it, the tension in the room bending toward her, as though half the men thought she was reckless, and the other half weren't sure if they were staring at genius or madness. Rubbed his temples, explained the attack profile. That was the moment Phoenix had been waiting for. She pulled her tablet from her pocket, connected it to the display. The canyon route appeared in jagged lines of topographical relief, each bend and rise she had traced 100 times in sleepless nights. The approach begins 40 kilometers out. I'll fly nap of the Earth masking behind to avoid early warning systems. At waypoint Alpha, I enter the canyon. She zoomed in, her voice tightening with focus. 15 kilometers of confined terrain, multiple turns, elevations, and choke points. But the walls will keep me hidden until I emerge here. She tapped the map, less than 2 kilometers from the compound. Cole's brow furrowed, and the HQ-7 systems. Oriented toward the 2 main corridors, Phoenix answered. They can't touch me inside this canyon. The SA-18s are shoulder-fired, useless against a moving target in that terrain. I'll have maybe 30 seconds from emergence to fire 3 Hellfires. That's all I need. The room had gone quiet again. The commanders stared at the glowing map, each lost in calculations, doubts, probabilities. Colonel Williams finally spoke. Chief, I need an honest assessment. How confident are you in flying this? Phoenix looked straight at him, the weight of the question pressing on her chest. Confidence wasn't what she felt. Not exactly. It was something more jagged, edged with fear, tempered by training. She thought of all the times she had survived what others called impossible. She thought of the she carried, the ghosts she flew with. Hi, sir, she said simply. Williams leaned back, exhaling slowly. Eyes narrowed. He didn't trust her certainty, maybe because it exposed his own hesitation. Chief said, his voice cutting the air, if you fail, if you're shot down, we lose not just an aircraft but 2 highly trained operators. Is this target worth that risk? The question was a dagger. Phoenix felt it twist deep because the risk wasn't theoretical. It had a face. Ghost's face, her co-pilot gunner. She could still see him joking in the hangar, steady hands on weapon systems, a man who trusted her flying even when she doubted herself. Could she drag him into this canyon of death on nothing but faith in her own skill? Her chest tightened. She hesitated just for a breath. And in that hesitation lived the war she always fought, the line between duty and conscience, bravery and recklessness, leadership and selfishness. But then she remembered Afghanistan again. The broken soldiers, the blood on the stretcher, the quiet rage of knowing air power could have changed it if someone had dared. She looked back at, and her voice steadied with something unshakable. Yes, sir, it is worth it. The colonel exchanged a long look with a silent battle. Then he nodded once. Chief Anderson, you have authorization to attempt the mission. Phoenix didn't breathe. Not until added, sharp as a blade. But listen carefully. If this doesn't work, if you can't make it through that canyon, if you see anything you don't like, you abort. Immediately. Is that understood? Phoenix nodded, understood. The word sealed it. The mission was hers. The briefing shifted, voices rising, details spilling onto the table. Contingency plans, abort codes, communication frequencies, but Phoenix barely heard them. She felt the weight settle onto her shoulders, heavier than her body armor, heavier than the helicopter itself. Because this wasn't just about proving she could fly where no one else dared. It was about the cost if she was wrong. Later that night, alone in her quarters, Phoenix sat with her hands open on her knees, staring at the faint tremor in her fingers. She had convinced them. She had made the impossible hers. And yet, beneath the fire of conviction, a quieter truth gnawed. She was terrified. She reached for the photograph tucked inside her flight manual. Her younger brother, killed years ago in a roadside bombing. His smile frozen in a frame that never aged. She had promised herself she would fight so others wouldn't have to come home draped in flags. That promise had carried her this far. And now, it would carry her into a canyon that could become her grave. Her eyes burned. She whispered into the empty room, not for him but for herself. "I'll make it. I have to." And though she tried to sleep, she lay awake long into the night, the sound of rotor blades and canyon winds chasing her into the dark. Why couldn't she stop replaying the canyon in her mind? Phoenix sat in the simulator bay, strapped into a motion rig that mimicked every tilt, every vibration, every sickening drop an Apache could endure. The projected walls of the canyon closed around her in glowing relief. She banked left, squeezed through a corridor barely wide enough for the rotor span, then snapped right. Her jaw tightened as alarms blared too close. She corrected, pulled hard, steadied. Again. The simulation ended, the screen fading to black. Sweat ran down her spine, soaking through the olive-green undershirt. She removed her helmet and exhaled. The tech running the sim gave her a cautious look. "That's your 5th run tonight, Chief. You're pushing fatigue." Phoenix stood, her body stiff from hours of repetition. "Fatigue's better than being a name on the memorial wall," she muttered. As she walked out, she found waiting. Ghost leaned against the bulkhead, arms crossed, dark hair falling over his forehead. He gave her that half-smile that was equal parts humor and warning. "You know," he said, "most people think sleep is a tactical advantage. Most people don't have to thread a 60-foot helicopter through a canyon the width of a country road." Pushed off the wall, following her down the corridor. "You're wound tight, Phoenix. I get it, hell, I'd be worried if you weren't. But you've run this canyon in sim 20 times already. At some point, you either believe you can do it or you don't." She stopped, turning to face him. "Do you?" The question hit heavier than intended. Its expression softened. "I've flown with you for years, watched you pull us out of messes no sane person would survived. If anyone can fly that canyon, it's you. My job's the easy one, point, lock, fire." Her lips curved faintly, but her eyes betrayed the storm inside. "There's nothing easy about what you're walking into with me. One mistake and—" Raised a hand, cutting her off. "Then it ends fast. But listen, we both signed up knowing one day it might. I'd rather go down flying beside the best than walk away knowing we never tried." For a moment, Phoenix felt her throat tighten. She wanted to tell him about the fear that kept her awake, about the shadow of failure that stalked her even in silence. But instead, she nodded. Trust, it didn't need words. They spent the next 2 days in relentless preparation. Intelligence officers fed them updated satellite imagery. Phoenix studied every rock, every bend, every ripple of terrain. Tested weapon systems again and again, memorizing timings until he could fire 3 Hellfires in less than 20 seconds. In between the drills, there were moments of quiet, moments when would catch her staring too long at the maps, her eyes distant. "What are you seeing?" he asked once. "I'm seeing the canyon as a coffin," she admitted softly, "and I'm trying to picture the way out." He didn't laugh, didn't reassure. He just placed a hand on her shoulder and squeezed. It was enough. The night before the mission, Phoenix sat alone in the hangar beside the Apache. The helicopter loomed in silence, its black frame gleaming under fluorescent lights. She ran her hand along the fuselage, feeling the cold metal beneath her fingertips. "You ready for this?" a voice asked. She turned. Colonel Williams stood a few paces away, his face shadowed by exhaustion and something else, respect. Phoenix straightened. "Yes, sir." Williams studied her a long moment. "When you first stood up in that room, I thought you were reckless, overconfident. Now I think you might be the only one stubborn enough to pull this off." Phoenix didn't answer. She kept her hand pressed to the Apache, her lifeline, her weapon, her coffin. William stepped closer, his voice lowered. "Don't mistake my words earlier. I don't doubt your skill. I doubt the world's fairness. Sometimes the best pilots don't come home. Promise me you'll abort if it's not there." Her chest ached with the weight of his words. "Promise me," as if promises meant anything when the sky turned against you. Still, she met his eyes. "I'll make the call when I have to." Williams nodded, knowing it was the only answer he'd get. He left her there with the machine and the silence. Hours later in the barracks, Phoenix lay awake staring at the ceiling. Sleep mocked her, dangling just out of reach. Memories crept in: her brother's laughter, the funerals she'd stood through, the faces of those who'd said she couldn't. She thought of the SEALs depending on her strike, of the 3 generals who believed themselves untouchable in their mountain fortress. And then she thought of, trusting her with his life, his last words possibly resting on her shoulders. The fear came in waves, sharp and cold, but beneath it deeper was something stronger: duty, defiance, and a strange kind of peace. When dawn broke, she rose without an alarm, was already waiting by the bird, helmet in hand. He looked at her, searching her face. "You sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. "Me neither," he grinned. "Guess that means we're ready." Phoenix climbed into the cockpit. The Apache hummed to life, systems awakening with mechanical precision. The sound vibrated through her bones. This was her world, her battlefield, her confession booth. As the blades spun faster, chopping the morning air, Phoenix exhaled. Every fear, every doubt, every ghost, they all blended into the rhythm of the rotors. She glanced at. He gave her a small nod, steady, unshaken. "All right, Ghost," she said into the comms, voice steady now. "Let's go prove impossible isn't real." The helicopter lifted, rising into the dawn. The earth fell away, the horizon stretched wide. Ahead lay 40 kilometers of mountains, a canyon that could kill them, and a fortress waiting to be burned into memory. Phoenix tightened her grip on the cyclic. The mission had begun. Why did the canyon look narrower in real life than it had on the map? Phoenix eased the Apache into the gap between 2 towers of rock, the valley walls closing like jaws around them. Sunlight broke in jagged beams through flashing across her canopy in blinding bursts. Her grip tightened on the cyclic, the vibration of the rotors surging through her arms. "Entering canyon," she whispered into the comms, though was already watching the altimeter tick down, the terrain map glowing red with proximity warnings. The helicopter shuddered as the wind shifted, a hard cross-gust slamming into the fuselage. Phoenix corrected instantly, tilting left, pulling power, steadying. She felt the edges of the canyon scrape across her senses. Every inch mattered now. His voice broke the tension. "Clear behind, no pursuit." "Stay sharp on sensors," Phoenix replied. "If they catch wind of us early, we won't have a chance." The walls rose higher. The canyon tightened. For a moment, it felt like flying inside a vein carved into the earth, twisting and pulsing with invisible forces. Phoenix's eyes darted between her instruments and the outside world. Too high and the rotors would clip stone. Too low and they'd smash into the rocky floor. The margin of error, 12 feet, give or take a heartbeat. The first turn came fast, a hard left curve that bent like a question mark. Phoenix leaned the bird into it, cyclic forward, pedals shifting. The rotors screamed as the blade skimmed dangerously close to the rock face. She held her breath, heart hammering, then rolled out smooth. Exhaled audibly, one down. Phoenix didn't smile, 14 more. They pressed deeper. The second turn was worse, an S-bend with walls narrowing to barely 50 feet apart. Phoenix slowed just enough to thread the Apache sideways, tail rotor kicking up dust as they scraped through. Warning screamed in her headset. Too close, too close. She ignored them, flying by instinct, by feel, by the muscle memory of thousands of hours. "This is insane flying," muttered, gripping his console. "This is Tuesday morning flying," Phoenix answered, her voice steady despite the sweat stinging her eyes. For 10 minutes, they snaked through bends and drops, the Apache twisting like a creature not built for such a place. The canyon swallowed them whole, and the outside world disappeared. Then came the first vertical rise. The walls shot upward, forcing Phoenix to climb hard while maintaining speed. The helicopter strained, engines whining against the altitude. The nose pitched. For a breath, the bird hung too close to stall. "Come on," she growled through clenched teeth, coaxing the machine upward, feeling the collective resist, then surge. They crested, the rotors just feet below jagged outcrops, then plunged again into shadow. Her pulse spiked, but her face betrayed nothing. This was what she lived for, the edge where failure and survival touched hands. Broke the silence again, softer this time. "You ever think about what happens if we don't make it out of this canyon?" Phoenix's jaw tightened, every turn. "And you still fly it." "I fly it because if I don't, someone else dies on the ground. Maybe dozens, maybe hundreds." Nodded slowly, eyes back on his console. "Good answer." The canyon bent again, sharper now, the turns coming faster. Dust swirled from their rotor wash, turning the air into a blinding haze. Phoenix squinted, relying on instinct as much as sight. Her hands moved in constant micro-adjustments, left, right, collective up, cyclic down, dancing with the machine in a rhythm that could not break. Minutes felt like hours. The canyon seemed endless, a test designed to strip away confidence until nothing remained but survival instinct. Then, without warning, the wind shifted again. A violent downdraft slammed into them mid-turn, shoving the Apache downward. The floor of the canyon rushed up. Phoenix shouted. She yanked the collective, engines screaming in protest. The nose pitched violently, the rotors clawing for lift. Dust and stone whipped past the canopy. For a heartbeat, she thought they were gone. But the bird responded barely. They skimmed the canyon floor, tail rotor scattering loose rock, then clawed upward again. Her breathing came fast now. She steadied, jaw locked. Hands shook on his console, but his voice came calm. "Still with you." Phoenix gave the briefest nod. That was all they had, trust sharper than fear. The canyon stretched on, narrowing further until it seemed carved precisely to break them. Phoenix's eyes burned from focus, every nerve screaming with effort. But with each turn conquered, her confidence hardened into steel. Finally, his voice cut in, sharp with anticipation. 30 seconds to emergence. Phoenix's chest tightened. This was it, the moment the canyon spat them out into the open, the compound in full view. She steadied her breath, calming the tremor in her hands. "Targets armed?" she asked. "Hellfire's hot. Acquisition system locked in standby." "Good. The second we clear the canyon, you find them. We'll have less than a minute." The last stretch rose before them. A 90-degree turn around a massive rock outcrop that shielded the compound from sight. Phoenix knew it well, the blind corner, the leap of faith. She tightened her grip. "Ghost, 30 seconds of hell, be ready." "Born ready," muttered, eyes narrowing at his display. Phoenix rolled the Apache into the turn, every muscle in her body braced. The rock wall flashed past the canopy, close enough to scrape paint. Then, suddenly, the world opened. They burst from shadow into sunlight, and there it was. The compound sprawled across the valley floor, fortified, bristling with weapons, 3 main buildings pulsing with heat signatures. The generals were inside, exactly where intelligence had promised. Phoenix steadied the bird, rotor blades roaring against the sudden open air. Her chest burned with adrenaline, fear, and grim resolve. His voice snapped sharp. 3 targets acquired, locking now. "Do it," Phoenix said, her voice ablade. Why did the valley fall silent in that instant before the missiles flew? Phoenix held the Apache steady, rotor blades howling, her eyes locked on the compound sprawled across the valley floor. For weeks she had studied those coordinates, the narrow angles, the approach that no one believed possible. Now here she was, alive, in firing position, with less than a minute before the fortress erupted in fire. His voice cut through the roar. Target 1 locked, heat signature confirmed, primary building. Phoenix felt her throat dry. "Send it." The first Hellfire leapt from its rail with a burst of smoke and fire, streaking across the narrow valley like vengeance itself. 8 seconds of flight, 8 seconds of suspended breath. Then, impact. The primary building shattered into a bloom of flame and dust, the shockwave rolling through the ground. "Direct hit," barked. "Target 1 destroyed." Phoenix didn't flinch. 2 and 3 now. His hands moved in muscle memory, the weapon system alive under his command. Locking, firing. 2 more missiles streaked away, leaving twin trails of white smoke curling against the rock walls. Phoenix's grip tightened. She didn't blink. She followed them with her whole body, willing them to strike true. The second Hellfire struck the communications building, the explosion ripping through walls and equipment. Fire surged skyward, swallowing antenna arrays in a shower of sparks. The third missile slammed into the reinforced bunker. For half a second, Phoenix feared it wouldn't breach. Then the warhead detonated, shaped charge piercing concrete and steel, blowing the structure into fragments. His voice cracked with adrenaline. 3 hits, 3 kills, all targets eliminated. For a heartbeat, relief surged through Phoenix like air after drowning, but it lasted less than a breath. Muzzle flashes erupted from the compound. Dozens of fighters spilled from hidden positions, weapons spitting fire into the sky. RPG trails arced upward, smoke curling into claws that reached for the Apache. "Contact," shouted, multiple hostiles engaging. Phoenix yanked the cyclic, pulling them into a climbing turn. Tracers lit the air around them, bright streaks of death. She weaved, banking left, then right, rotor wash scattering dust and debris. The canyon that had shielded them now lay behind, and going back meant flying into an ambush already forming at its mouth. "Phoenix, they're moving heavy weapons to the canyon entrance," warned. Her mind raced. The plan was to retreat the way they came, but now that path was a trap. The only way out was the way no one expected, up and over. She heard her own voice before she'd fully decided. "We're going vertical." His head snapped toward her. "That's suicide. We'll be exposed to every gun in the valley." "They're watching the canyon, not the sky." She shoved the collective, engines screaming as the Apache clawed upward. The helicopter lurched, fighting altitude and gravity. Tracers whipped past, closer, brighter, each one a heartbeat from ending them. Phoenix gritted her teeth, banking hard, throwing off the enemy's aim. For 30 seconds they were naked against the dawn, silhouetted against the pale sky. 30 seconds where any competent gunner could swat them from existence. Phoenix's whole body tightened, flying with instinct more than thought, every nerve alive with fear and focus. Cursed as an RPG streaked past, missing them by mere meters. The explosion rocked the air, the Apache shuddering in its wake. "Hang on," Phoenix roared, yanking them higher, faster. The valley fell away beneath them, the compound shrinking into smoke and flame. Gunfire trailed behind, ineffective now as distance widened. The radio crackled, mission command breaking the silence. "Phoenix, control, we have you on radar. Report." Phoenix's chest heaved, her hands still locked in a death grip on the controls. Control, Phoenix. Mission accomplished. 3 targets destroyed. Aircraft intact. Exfiltrating. Static, then a burst of disbelief. Confirm, all 3 eliminated. Answered for her, voice sharp with pride. Confirmed. Direct hits on all target structures. All generals neutralized. The command center erupted in cheers that Phoenix could almost hear through the comms. But inside the cockpit, there was no room for celebration. Not yet. She steadied their climb, leveling out once the valley was miles behind. Her arms ached from the strain, her head pounded from the adrenaline. Leaned back, exhaling hard, his grin wide despite the sweat dripping down his face. Phoenix, he said, shaking his head in awe. That was insane. I've never seen flying like that. You just rewrote the damn book. She didn't smile. Not yet. The weight of what they'd done pressed heavy on her chest. The 3 generals were gone, their networks crippled, their plans erased. But the cost could have been her crew, her machine, her own life. And beneath the adrenaline, fear still lingered, sharp, quiet, unforgiving. The flight back was long but uneventful. Compared to the canyon, the open sky felt endless. Yet Phoenix couldn't shake the images burned into her mind. The canyon walls inches from her rotors, the RPG streaks that nearly found them, the thought of trust hanging in her hands. When they finally touched down at base, the rotors slowing, a crowd was already waiting. Commanders, analysts, mechanics, soldiers, all eyes locked on the Apache as it rolled to a stop. Phoenix powered down, her hands trembling slightly as she flicked switches. Unstrapped, still grinning, his voice carrying. We did it. Damn it, Phoenix, we actually did it. She removed her helmet slowly, her hair falling loose from the bun. The air outside felt too still, too ordinary after the storm of the mission. She climbed down, boots hitting the ground, and was met by Commander himself. His face was unreadable for a moment. Then he spoke, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. Chief Anderson, that was the most incredible flying I've ever witnessed. You just proved every single one of us wrong. Phoenix met his eyes. Her reply was quiet, almost reluctant. Sir, it was a team effort. Ghost's precision made it possible. Stepped out beside her, grinning ear to ear. And Phoenix's flying kept us alive. Don't let her downplay it. Colonel Williams approached, his gaze steady, filled with something that looked almost like respect. Chief, when you volunteered, I thought you were reckless. Now I realize you're the reason this mission didn't cost us dozens of lives. You changed the battlefield today. Phoenix exhaled, the weight of their words pressing heavier than the helicopter she'd just flown. She wanted to feel pride. She wanted to feel triumph. But instead, she felt only exhaustion and the quiet knowledge that survival today didn't erase the risks that still haunted her. That night, alone in her quarters, she sat in silence. She stared at her hands, still trembling faintly. She thought of her brother, of promises whispered to photographs. She thought of trust, the SEALs who would live because of what she'd done, and the generals who would never kill again. And in the quiet, she whispered words no one else would ever hear. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts. Why did the applause feel heavier than the silence of the canyon? Phoenix sat in the debriefing room, the same one where days earlier she had stood ignored in the shadows. Now every seat was filled with officers, analysts, even younger pilots pressed against the back wall, eager to witness the unraveling of the impossible mission. Colonel Williams stood at the front, the satellite images from the compound flashing across the screen before and after. Before, 3 fortified structures, intact, protected by walls and guns. After, smoldering ruins, black scars spread across the valley floor. 3 targets, 3 strikes, 3 eliminations, Williams announced. All achieved in under 30 seconds, by an aircraft everyone in this room agreed couldn't reach that target. Murmurs spread, a mix of awe and disbelief. Phoenix sat rigid, hands clasped on the table. She felt his presence beside her, his calm steady as always. William's eyes scanned the room. Chief Anderson and Chief did more than accomplish the mission. They rewrote what we thought was possible. Applause erupted, sharp and loud. Phoenix winced, the sound crashing over her. She forced a polite nod, but inside it didn't feel like victory. It felt like a weight pressing harder against her chest. Commander leaned forward, studying her. "Chief, tell us, what was it like in the canyon?" The question silenced the room. Phoenix hesitated. Her mouth opened, then closed. How could she explain the suffocating walls, the way every gust of wind felt like a blade at her throat, the raw edge between control and oblivion? Finally, she said softly, "It was like flying through a coffin, but one I'd memorized well enough to escape." The words landed heavy. The younger pilots in the back exchanged looks, a mix of fear and reverence. Broke the tension with a grin. "For the record, sir, I'd like it noted that I told her this was insane flying. She called it Tuesday morning." Laughter rippled. Phoenix allowed the faintest smile, but only for a moment. The analysts began peppering her with questions. Flight path tolerances, wind compensation, missile sequencing. She answered each with crisp detail, her voice controlled, professional. But beneath it, her heart pounded with a truth she couldn't voice, that she had been terrified every second, that survival had been a thread so thin it still quivered inside her. When the briefing ended, Williams dismissed the room but called her back. Alone now, his face softened. "Chief, I owe you an apology. I doubted you. I thought you were reckless." Phoenix lowered her gaze. "Maybe I was, sir." He shook his head. "No, reckless gets people killed. What you did was different. You calculated risk with precision. You saw opportunity where the rest of us saw walls. That's leadership." His words stung, not with pride but with responsibility. Leadership. She had never sought it, only survival. Yet here she was, being told her defiance had reshaped doctrine. That night Phoenix and sat outside the hangar, the desert air cool, stars stretched endless above them. Leaned back on his elbows, staring upward. "You realize they're going to be writing about this for years, right?" Phoenix shook her head. "They'll forget, missions blur, names fade." "Not this one," he said, "not you." Silence settled between them. For the first time since takeoff, Phoenix allowed herself to breathe, really breathe. The tension eased from her shoulders, and yet another feeling crept in, the quiet guilt of survival. Must have sensed it. He turned, his voice softer. "You're thinking about what could happen." She didn't deny it. If we'd clipped one wall, if that downdraft had been stronger, if one of those RPGs had flown. "But they didn't," said firmly. "Because you didn't let them. You flew that bird like no one else could." Phoenix's throat tightened. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe survival was skill, not luck. But the truth was messier, and it lingered in the silence between stars. Days passed. The mission's success rippled outward. Intelligence confirmed the deaths of all three generals. Enemy networks fractured, communication lines faltered, planned attacks collapsed before they could begin. The victory was clear. But for Phoenix, clarity never came. She was summoned to headquarters, where brass from higher commands lined the room. They spoke in terms of decapitation strike, strategic disruption, textbook execution. They praised her composure, her skill, her courage. She nodded, answered questions, signed reports, but inside she drifted. After the meeting, pulled her aside. "Chief, you've proven something none of us believed. We want you to develop training for others. Teach them how to fly like you did." Her stomach nodded. Teach. Could she turn chaos into curriculum? Could she break down instinct into lessons for others to follow? Saw the hesitation. "I know you carry this heavy, but listen, you may have saved more lives today than any in years. Not just because you killed them, because you showed what can be done." She stood silent, absorbing his words. Saving lives, killing to save. The paradox she lived by. That evening, back in her quarters, Phoenix pulled out the photograph of her brother again. His smile never changed. Hers had. She whispered, "I did it, but it doesn't feel like winning. It feels like surviving." Her voice cracked, but no one heard. Knocked once before stepping in. He carried 2 mugs of coffee, steam curling into the dim light. He set one on her desk. "Thought you could use this." Phoenix managed a faint smile. "Thanks." He sat across from her, sipping quietly. After a while he spoke. "You know, people are already calling it Phoenix flying." She blinked. "What?" "The canyon run. The crazy maneuvers, the whole thing. They're nomming it after you." Phoenix shook her head sharply. "No, it was us. It was both of us." Tilted his head, considering. "Maybe, but you're the one who stood up when everyone else sat down. You're the one who believed in it first." Her chest ached. She didn't want the glory. She didn't want the name. She wanted the silence of the canyon to fade, the sound of RPG trails to leave her ears. But she knew it wouldn't. Not ever. She met his eyes. "If they want to call it Phoenix flying, fine, but we'll teach it, both of us. Because if others try it blind, they'll die." Smiled faintly. "Fair enough." In that moment, she realized the next mission had already begun. Not in the skis, not against fortresses, but in classrooms and simulators, where she would pass on what she had learned in blood and fire. Her role was shifting, from survivor to teacher, from lone pilot to mentor. And though the burden felt heavy, there was dignity in it. Because sometimes, leadership wasn't about being the one who flew through the coffin. It was about making sure others could and survive. Why did the simulator feel colder than the canyon itself? Phoenix stood at the front of a small classroom, 12 sets of eyes staring back at her. Experienced pilots, each with more than 1,000 hours in combat. Hardened men and women who had flown through dust storms, dodged SAMs, pulled wounded crews from burning skis. Yet they all looked at her with something between doubt and curiosity. Behind her, a screen showed the canyon, the same twisting scar of Earth she had flown through weeks earlier. On the map it looked clinical, harmless, just lines and shadows. But Phoenix saw it for what it was, a grave waiting for the unprepared. She took a slow breath. "Welcome to precision strike training, or as some of you have already heard it called," she let the pause hang, "Phoenix flying." A ripple of chuckles spread through the room. She didn't smile. "I need you to understand something," she continued, voice sharp. "That name isn't a compliment, it's a warning. What I did in that canyon wasn't magic. It wasn't luck. It was years of practice, failures you'll never see, and the knowledge that if I screwed up once, I'd be dead. If you came here looking for heroics, you're in the wrong room." The silence that followed was heavy, but she wanted it that way. She wanted them to feel the weight before they ever touched a cyclic. Stood at the side of the room, arms folded, watching her with quiet pride. He had insisted on joining as co-instructor. "If we're going to teach them," he'd said, "they need both sides, the flying and the firing." Phoenix turned back to the screen. "Here's the first lesson. Every aircraft has an operational envelope. Most pilots never test it. They fly where doctrine tells them, how doctrine tells them. But doctrine doesn't win when the terrain is built to kill you. You need to know your aircraft so deeply you can bend that envelope without breaking it." She zoomed in on the canyon map. "This isn't about bravery. This is about precision. Every inch matters, every second counts, and every mistake is final." The first days of training were brutal. Phoenix pushed her students into simulators that mimicked confined terrain. She forced them through turns so tight alarms screamed constantly. Some clipped virtual canyon walls within minutes. Others froze, overwhelmed by the chaos of confined space flying. When one pilot slammed the simulator into the canyon floor for the third time, he threw off his helmet, sweat dripping down his face. "This is insane," he muttered. "No one can fly this." Phoenix walked up, her eyes steady. "That's exactly what they said to me, and then I flew it." The pilot looked away, chastened. Added, his voice calmer, "The canyon doesn't care if you're scared, but fear sharpens you if you let it. The trick isn't to get rid of fear, it's to make it your ally." Bit by bit, the students improved. They learned to trust their instruments without losing touch with instinct. They learned to coordinate as pilot and gunner, to communicate in clipped, steady tones even when alarms screamed. But Phoenix carried her own unease. Each night after training, she lay awake wondering if she was teaching them to survive or teaching them to die in narrower coffins. She remembered the downdraft that nearly ended her, the RPG trails cutting the air. She wondered, could these pilots react with the same instinct, the same desperate defiance? Or was she passing on a path that only she had been able to walk? One evening found her in the hangar, staring at the simulator rig in silence. "You're carrying it too heavy," he said gently. She didn't look at him. What if I'm wrong? What if I'm training them to believe they can survive something they... He stepped closer. What if you're training them to save lives when no one else can? She turned then, meeting his eyes. In them she saw the same trust that had carried them through the canyon. Slowly, she nodded. Weeks passed. The program grew harder. Phoenix introduced wind shear scenarios, forced engine failures, surprise ambushes. She wanted them to feel chaos before chaos felt them. Some broke under the strain. One pilot requested reassignment, admitting he couldn't handle the claustrophobia of confined space flying. Phoenix respected him more for leaving than she did for those who stayed out of pride. But others thrived. They began to move like extensions of their machines, fluid, precise, almost graceful. Phoenix watched one team thread a simulator canyon without a single alarm sounding. When they emerged, the pilot removed his helmet, eyes wide with exhilaration. "Ma'am," he said, voice trembling, "I didn't think I could do it, but now I know I can." Phoenix studied him. She remembered the first time she had felt that rush, the dangerous intoxication of defying limits. She spoke firmly. "Don't confuse confidence with invincibility. The canyon doesn't care who you are. Respect it, or it will kill you." The most important moment came halfway through the course. Phoenix gathered the students in the classroom again. She stood before them, the canyon map glowing behind her. "One of you asked me last week how to calculate acceptable risk," she began. "The truth is, you can't put it on a chart. You weigh it against the lives you're trying to save. In Desert Scimitar, 3 generals were about to unleash attacks that would have killed hundreds. Risking 1 aircraft, 2 crew was acceptable, but if it had been a lesser target, maybe not." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. Acceptable risk is about the mission, not the glory. If you're flying for medals or names or reputation, you'll die. Fly for the people who need you. Fly for the ones who won't come home if you don't. That's the only calculation that matters. The room was silent. The students weren't just listening, they were absorbing. Some nodded slowly, as if filing her words away in a place deeper than memory. After class, one of the younger pilots approached her privately. His voice was low, almost hesitant. "Ma'am, when you flew that canyon, were you scared?" Phoenix met his eyes. She considered lying. She considered saying she had been steady, fearless, composed, but then she shook her head. "I was terrified every second." The pilot blinked, surprised. "And that's why I survived," she continued. "Fear kept me sharp. Fear kept me alive. Don't ever think you have to be fearless to succeed. You just have to be willing to fly anyway." The pilot swallowed hard, then nodded. That night Phoenix sat with outside again, stars stretched across the desert sky. He nudged her with his shoulder. "You know, you might be a better teacher than a pilot." She snorted softly. "That's impossible." Grinned, "Exactly." Phoenix looked up at the stars. For the first time since Desert Scimitar, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt hopeful. Because maybe this was how survival became meaning, by passing it on. Why did the past feel closer when she stood in front of her students? Phoenix walked slowly across the stage of the Army Aviation School auditorium. The years had etched faint lines across her face, but her eyes, sharp, steady, unyielding, carried the same fire. 100 pilots sat before her, their uniforms crisp, their shoulders squared, some of them younger than she'd been when she first touched an Apache cyclic. Behind her, the screen glowed with a satellite image, the infamous canyon, forever marked in doctrine as Anderson's Run. She paused, letting silence stretch. It was a trick she'd learned long ago. Silence made words heavier. 3 years ago, she began, her voice calm but carrying to the farthest seat, I flew through this canyon. Everyone told me it couldn't be done. They were right, it couldn't by the rules they lived by. But missions don't care about rules. Missions only care about outcomes. The room stilled. Some leaned forward, pens poised over notebooks. Others simply stared, knowing they were listening to a legend. I'm not here to tell you how brave I was, she continued. I was terrified. Every turn, every gust of wind, every shadow on those walls, I thought it might be the last thing I saw. But fear isn't weakness. Fear sharpens. Fear reminds you what's at stake. She let that sink in before adding softly, if you leave here with one lesson, let it be this. Don't waste time trying to erase fear. Learn to fly with it. Sat at the edge of the stage, older too, but still carrying the same wry smile. He gave a subtle nod, as if reminding her that truth carried more weight than myth. After the lecture, Phoenix walked the halls alone. Plaques and photographs lined the walls, heroes, fallen comrades, innovators. She stopped at one display, a framed manual she had helped author, Terrain-Masked Aviation Operations. Beneath it was a quote attributed to her. Impossible missions aren't solved by better machines. They're solved by pilots who refuse to believe impossible means forever. She touched the glass lightly, remembering the night she wrote those words, exhausted, haunted but unwilling to let the canyon become just her story. Later in the training hangar, she watched her students in simulators. They twisted virtual Apache through digital canyons, alarms wailing, engines straining. Some failed spectacularly, smashing against walls. Others emerged shaky but alive. She stood behind them, offering calm corrections, never praise too quickly given, never criticism too sharp. She saw herself in them, the determination, the fear, the stubborn defiance. And she wondered how many of them would one day face a canyon of their own. That evening, as the base quieted, Phoenix and sat outside again as they had so many times. The desert stretched wide, the stars infinite. You ever think about that day? Asked, voice low. Every day, she admitted. He nodded. Me too, but not the explosions, not the generals, just the moment before. When you pulled us into that canyon and I realized I trusted you completely. That's what sticks. Her throat tightened. Trust. That word weighed more than medals, more than promotions. Trust had carried them out of the coffin alive. She turned her gaze to the horizon. Sometimes I wonder if we should died there, if it would made more sense. The impossible mission ending with the impossible cost. Shook his head firmly. No, we lived so others wouldn't have to die. That's the only math that matters. Phoenix stayed quiet, but his words settled deep. Months later, she stood at a memorial ceremony for pilots lost in another operation. Rows of boots and helmets lined the grass, names etched into stone. She spoke to the families, her voice steady even as her heart broke. They were not reckless, she said. They were willing to go where others wouldn't, willing to face what others feared, and in that willingness lives were saved. She saw her brother's face in every grieving parent, every widow, every child clutching folded flags. She carried the weight for them, the way she always had. Years passed. Phoenix rose in rank, eventually leading the development of next-generation tactics. Drones, AI-assisted targeting, advanced stealth, the battlefield evolved. Yet still, young pilots came to her asking the same question. How do you survive the impossible? Her answer never changed. By not flying for yourself, fly for the ones who need you, fly for the ones who can't. One evening, older now, she returned alone to the canyon. The war had shifted elsewhere, but the land remained the same, unforgiving, silent, eternal. She stood at the rim, the wind cold against her face. Closing her eyes, she could hear the rotor blades again, feel the downdraft slamming, see the RPG trails cutting the air. Her body remembered every motion, every heartbeat of terror. But she also remembered emerging. She remembered its voice, 3 hits, 3 kills. She remembered the climb, the sky opening, survival snatched from jaws that should closed. She whispered into the wind, "You didn't take me then, you won't take me now." The canyon gave no answer. It never did. Back at the academy, her final class gathered. She stood before them one last time, her voice steady but softer now, carrying the weight of years. "You will all face moments when doctrine fails, when the books say impossible, when fear tells you to turn back. In those moments, you'll hear my voice reminding you the limits aren't the canyon, they're yours, and they're meant to be tested." She paused, her eyes sweeping across their faces. "But remember, you're not flying for glory. You're not flying for names. You're flying for the soldier on the ground who believes no one is coming, for the families who will never know your name but who will live because of what you did. That's why we fly into the impossible." When she finished, the room was silent. Then, slowly, the pilots rose to their feet in quiet respect. Phoenix didn't need applause. She didn't need medals. She only needed to know the torch had been passed. That night, sitting alone, she wrote her final journal entry, words she would never publish, but words that carried the truth of her life. "The canyon was never about proving I could fly it. It was about proving fear doesn't own us. It was about the lives saved, not the lives risked. And maybe that's the lesson. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to fly anyway. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts." She closed the notebook, placed it beside her brother's photograph, and exhaled into the silence. The war would always continue somewhere. The impossible would always wait. But Phoenix had done her part, not just in flying, but in teaching others to rise from fire, to make possible what the world called impossible. And in that she found her peace.